Hello and welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest. November 14th, 2024, the Attorney General Matt Gaetz edition. Nothing more need be said. I am David Plotz of CityCast in Washington, D.C. From New York City and CBS News. It's John Dickerson. Hello, John.
Hello, David. Hi, Emily, even though I don't know whether to say hi to you before you've been introduced, but there you are.
And from the New York Times and Yale University Law School, and literally sitting under a blanket behind a parking garage.
Yeah, on my way to LaGuardia.
Who loves the Gabfest so much that she is risking arrest for public loitering and public nuisance, is Emily Bazelon.
These are not preemptive attempts to hide under the Gaetz regime at the Department of Justice.
No, but it's pretty good incognito. I have a big thank you to the really nice parking lot attendant who parked me on the sidewalk right outside the parking garage and then said that if the cops come, I should just leave, which seems like good advice.
This week on the Gabfest, Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, Kirsty Noem for Homeland Security, some Fox guy for Department of Defense. How are the Trump cabinet and White House shaping up? How radical will they be or not be? Then the Democratic autopsy. The party tries to understand a cataclysmic defeat and move forward from it. What have they learned so far? Then Trump seems determined to deport millions of undocumented people. How would he carry out mass deportations? What could block or delay him? We are going to talk to the expert on the immigration process and the deportation process, Caitlin Dickerson of The Atlantic, no relation to John. Plus, we'll have cocktail chatter and a reminder that we have our annual Conundrum show coming up on Wednesday, December 4th at 7:30 p.m. at the Bell House in Brooklyn. It's going to be really fun. The Conundrums are rolling in. They're amazing. Here are a few that came in this week that I loved. This is for you, John. If you could go back in time with one book and give it to one person, what book would it be? Who would you give it to and why?
Oh, that's so great. I aspire to be worthy of being able to answer that question.
The next one, very much for you, Emily. You can add one sentence to the U.S. Constitution. What is it? And it can't be like a 10,000 word sentence. It can't be a Proustian sentence. It's got to be a regular sentence. Then, for me, apropos of Planet of the Apes, what animal would you most want to live in a world ruled by? What animal would you least want to be ruled by? Yes. So we'll tackle those questions and more December 4th. At the Bell House in Brooklyn. Go to slate.com/Gabfest live to get tickets. We'll have a special guest. And if you have a conundrum you want to share with us, go to slate.com/conundrum and share it.
Was the line in the Constitution or was it an amendment? It was in the original. Was the question in the original text or amendment?
Text. So
text.
Yeah. So sure. Make it Article 10.
Article 10. Everyone Wang Chung tonight.
Okay.
This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Wondery's The Best Idea Yet. Did you know that the McDonald's Happy Meal has sold over 35 billion boxes, making it the best-selling meal in history? Or that Levi's 501 jeans wouldn't have been invented without the California Gold Rush? Or that Birkenstocks were actually designed over 250 years ago? Introducing The Best Idea Yet, a new podcast about the surprising origin stories of the products you're obsessed with and the people who brought them to life. Take Super Mario, the best-selling video game character of all time. He only exists because Nintendo couldn't get the rights to Popeye. And the McDonald's Happy Meal, that idea first came from a mom in Guatemala. Every week on The Best Idea Yet, you'll discover the surprising stories behind viral products, like Pez dispensers and Air Jordans, while picking up real business insights along the way. Follow The Best Idea Yet on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen to The Best Idea Yet early and ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus. Based on his choices so far, first of all, Emily could definitely be Attorney General because she has as much legal experience, I think, as Matt Gaetz does. But it's going to be bad to be a dog in Trump's America. It's going to be good to be a war criminal. And it's an open question about whether it's going to be great or terrible for 17-year-old girls. So Trump's cabinet and top White House appointments that he's announced so far are a mix of pretty conventional and extremely weird. On the conventional side, Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, Susie Wiles as Chief of Staff, Tom Homan as Border Czar. I mean, he's a conventional choice, not necessarily the choice I would make. On the deeply weird side, Matt Gaetz as Attorney General, which I'm sure that's the rabbit hole we're going to end up down for most of this topic. Kirsty, the dog murderer Noam as Homeland Security Secretary. War criminal apologist and Fox personality Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense. Conspiracist Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence. Various others, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy running the non-existent Department of Government Efficiency.
Which is so efficient, it requires two people to run it.
Right. And also that its name itself is a meme. Like that they create a department of, because Doge, because Elon Musk has this Dogecoin thing. They make a meme just to troll everybody. What the hell? A department of memes. Emily, let's start with Matt Gaetz, please. Barely a lawyer, is been facing a House investigation, which has now been suspended because he's resigned from the House for sexual misconduct, drug use, accepting improper gifts, attempting to obstruct an investigation. He's never run a movie theater, much less the most powerful legal entity in the world. What to make of Matt Gaetz as Attorney General, and can he get confirmed? Like even with a appliant Senate.
Yeah, these are some great questions. Matt Gaetz briefly worked in private practice as a lawyer before joining the Florida House of Representatives. I learned this when I Googled, is Matt Gaetz a lawyer? Which did not seem like an obvious thing.
He's the pride of William and Mary Law School.
Yes, exactly. I mean, look, when you think of the Gaetz, Hegseth, Gabbard choices all in one day, this is like either a huge flex in which Trump is showing who's boss, picking people who are loyal to him, who are just as suspicious of the system as it normally works, of the establishment of, American institutions as he is. Or he is kind of putting these people out there, at least, expecting one or two of them to fall, right? Like thinking, okay, well, this would be great if it worked out, but maybe it won't, and that's okay. I have no idea which of the two it is. And the reaction among Republican senators, who are the only ones who count since they have the majority, was kind of a mix. You had a couple of people, namely Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, say the obvious thing, which is that this is shocking and that Matt Gaetz is not qualified to be Attorney General. And then you have a lot of other people saying, hey, President Trump, we trust him. Fine, no problem, including people who'd been quite exercised about this investigation of Matt Gaetz into charges of sexual misconduct involving a 17-year-old. It was itself a criminal investigation. Congress was investigating until Gaetz resigned yesterday. And, it's just, we're just going to have to see. John, what do you think about the politics? I mean, do you think that the Senate, now that Senator Thune has been elected majority leader, is actually going to take its advise and consent responsibilities seriously and perform its traditional role, or do you think they're just going to roll over?
It's a great question. That's the big, larger question. Trump has suggested that the Senate go into recess so that he can basically appoint all these people without having to go through the confirmation process, which matters a great deal with Matt Gaetz, because you could imagine in the confirmation process in the Senate hearings, them requesting the House Ethics Committee report, which will go away since Gaetz resigned from the House after Trump announced his appointment. Usually what happens, I believe, with those kinds of ethics reports is, since the person is no longer in the body, a report that would be the background of either censuring or kicking somebody out of the body no longer matters, since they're no longer in it. But in a hearing, you could imagine, and also, by the way, you could imagine people, he has very few friends in the House and Senate, so you could imagine people, it getting leaked or whatever. We should return to the question of Gaetz and whether he's what's, I think, called an anchoring bid in negotiation, which I think is what you were suggesting, David, which is you make an outrageous first bid, knowing that it'll get shot down, but it anchors expectations so that when you then nominate, Matt Gaetz 2.0 or someone very much like him for to be head of the Department of Justice, somebody who's completely in keeping with everything Trump wants, which is loyalty, pliability, and perhaps even an active thirst for retribution. Because it's not Matt Gaetz, it'll seem less crazy. And so Matt Gaetz is really the first part in a two-part strategy. I don't know that that's the case, but it's certainly something that negotiators do and something certainly Trump has done. But returning just to this quick question of recess appointments, I went back and read the Supreme Court ruling when Obama was slapped by the court for making recess appointments to the National Labor Relations Board. And it was the conservatives, particularly Scalia, who said, it totally shreds the separation of powers to give the president power to make recess appointments that are beyond the scope of the Constitution. And the way he defined it is that, first of all, recess appointments can only happen intersession, which is to say between sessions of the Senate, not when the Senate just happens to be off for 10 days, which is the rule of the Supreme Court ultimately because it was a non-conservative majority. But basically, the conservative position, the Scalia position, was you can only make these appointments when you're between Senates. So already the Trumps wouldn't fly by that. And also, this was also interesting. Scalia argued that appointments should only be made for vacancies that arise during the recess itself. These vacancies, of course, did not arise just during the vacancy because they arose with the election of a new president. So by the standards of originalism and conservative politics, this wouldn't even be worthy of a conversation. However, Senator Thune and Cornyn, who were the two running for the leadership post Thune ultimately became it, said it's possible, certainly possible, that there could be recess appointments. So this is a real test of whether the Senate exists to do, its institutional job or whether it's just going to roll over for Trump.
And just to be clear, the majority opinion in that case, it's called Noel Canning, says that there is no constitutional impediment to what Trump is proposing here because in the Obama situation, Obama was clashing with the Senate and the Senate was trying to stop him and he was trying to get around them by doing recess appointments. This would be a situation in which the Senate just folds and abdicates its role by going out of session for more than 10 days, which was like the minimum amount the Supreme Court talked about. So if the Senate goes along with this, Trump can do it, and it's impossible to imagine the current Supreme Court standing in the way, I would say.
I personally suspect that there will be relatively normal confirmation hearings, and I don't know that everyone's going to get through. Maybe Gaetz is the exception, but there's a Senate majority that Republicans have. They're going to make sure there's something that is like a hearing that happens because it gives a lot more legitimacy. And I think Trump will want it because it actually gets senators on board supporting these nominees.
It tattoos them with the lowering of standards.
And also the fact that Thune won the contest as majority leader, right? That also factors in here. He was challenged by Rick Scott, who was like the hard rights candidate. Trump didn't totally get behind Scott because he didn't think he had the votes. And Thune is an institutionalist. So that also goes to your point.
Can we go back to these nominees? Because even if you assume, I think, John, you're right that Gaetz may be a sacrificial lamb, although he did give up his House seat. So he clearly thinks this is real.
That helped him get out of jail.
It helped him get out of an ethics report. But there's the Republican House was, well, I don't know. Who knows what was going to happen? So Gaetz may be a sacrificial lamb. I don't think all these people are sacrificial lambs. I don't think you don't put out all these names with the idea that none of them are going to get confirmed and we're just going to pick our second choice, because that also is weakness. That demonstrates I can't actually get the people I'm naming. Trump does not like to demonstrate weakness. He wants to prove, he wants to alpha dog it. And so I assume that these are serious names and he intends to get these people confirmed. And I'm interested in what you guys think about this. What I think is the most interesting tension here is between the kind of the Hegseth and Gaetz and Lee Zeldin and Tulsi Gabbard and some of the others are defined by sort of eagerness and submissiveness and extremism, but have no record of bureaucratic accomplishment or competence. And I wonder what you think about that, whether somebody like Matt Gaetz, who obviously is incredibly good showman, or Hegseth, who is a great showman, but neither of them has ever run anything, can be effective in roles like this, or does it depend on just having good deputies and that you can actually have a showman running the Department of Defense?
I just want to jump in because when you originally said Emily would be qualified for the Trump position of Attorney General, actually she wouldn't be, right? Because the qualification is loyalty to him and showmanship. And so that to me leads to the answer to your question is, what if the project is not running these departments effectively? What if the project is essentially dismantling them and having them either collapse because everybody resigns under Attorney General Matt Gaetz, or they just don't do a bunch of their jobs? Now, the Department
but you don't want that for the Department of Defense.
I was going to say,
though.
the Department of Defense is a much trickier question. And that's really, because you do at some point want it to act in the service of your goals, whether it's, and you can imagine, by the way, speaking of goals, like at the confirmation hearing for Hegseth, will you approve of the use of the U.S. military against U.S. citizens? Yes or no? If he says no, then that's, I don't know. We'll see what he says. But you're right. I guess the question for me is more related to the Department of Defense. And then I guess on intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard is, it's in some of these cases, it's not just they have no experience. They have experience that is contraindicated to the objectives of the job.
Tulsi Gabbard goes around saying that the U.S. has planted secret bioweapons labs in Russia. She's really out there.
Yeah, and it just makes you realize, the act of destroying trust is it's really easy to destroy trust in institutions, very hard to build trust in institutions. And having somebody who's deeply incompetent or malevolent or wishes ill upon an institution, it's not just bad for the moment. It's bad for generations to come because it just makes people doubt government. And so I think what's going to be, I guess there are people who appear to me to be more or less likely to be competent. I think Tom Homan will be a competent border czar, which means he will carry out with probably ruthless efficiency what Trump desires and carry out those policy measures. What's more interesting to me is the acts of destruction of centers of traditional government activity. There are people who want to destroy the FBI, the IRS, the Department of Education, the CIA, the ATF, DEA. There are people who literally say these institutions should not exist. And some of them, in some cases, are going to be heavily in charge of those institutions. And the question is, are they going to be captured by the institution, just try to change the mission but make it work? Or are they going to literally try to destroy the institution? That's going to be, I think, the most horrifying and rubbernecky kind of daunting thing to watch, because if you destroy the capacity of the IRS to collect taxes, it's not just, it doesn't make the country a better place. It just makes it a place where we don't have revenue to run the country. So it's very frightening.
Just on that point about the IRS, it reminds me of the other thing, which is that, Trump was elected to the extent, and we'll talk about this in the next topic, if at the very least he was elected because people were unhappy with the inflation picture of the previous administration. And if you look at what the bond market how the bond market has reacted to the Trump election, it has not been favorable. It assumes that inflation will go up, either because of tariffs or because of the migrant workers who do all of the labor are going to be swept out of the country, and that's going to increase prices and wages. His spending programs are going to balloon the deficit well beyond even the fears of the Center for Responsible Budget. And so the bond market is already saying, oh my God, inflation's going to get worse, and we're pricing that in. You're about the IRS. The IRS is one tiny thing that can help with that deficit picture, although not much. So if it has been dismantled or is just kind of shambling around, the market will have a reaction, as well as a reaction to the just general level of chaos that we're talking about here, as you have people who are either incompetent or actively working against the traditions of the institutions. It's going to be just the general sound of the static, I think, will create market reactions that might have a certain kind of force that other things that don't.
To get back to Matt Gaetz for a moment and this question of, whether the institution can capture people like him, they're there as outsiders, right? I mean, all their affirmation is coming from other directions, coming from Trump, from being a loyalist, from the people who are sharply, sharply critical of these institutions. So, yeah, sure, you can hire a bunch of competent deputies and make them very powerful, but you also can decide which parts of the institution you wish to continue to function, right? I mean, if Trump is going to carry out his threats to prosecute his enemies, then DOJ has to do some things to try to make those investigations happen. But you can also stop it from doing a lot of other things by gumming up the works, or like you said, prompting mass resignations. Or don't forget, we still have the prospect of mass firings or cowing people with some firings so that everyone else keeps their head down. I mean, it just seems like Trump is very deliberately inviting chaos. And obviously that's part of his script. And we're with these picks, I think we're seeing a desire that he has to really unleash it. And then it's just a question of whether the Senate performs its role as being a check and balance.
I guess one of the things when I think about the role of media, and I'm as usual, I'm channeling a version of something that Matt Iglesias was saying. But I do think that one of the responsibilities of media in the Trump administration is going to be to focus less on the circus-like aspect. Oh my God, it's Matt Gaetz, sexual predator, and more on the literally how has the Department of Justice ceased to function? How has it ceased to prosecute, drug dealers? Like that's a kind of thing that would be interesting.
Totally, and that's why it's 100. I was looking at this up along just those lines. 115,000 employees with 40 different components, which include countering terrorism and violent extremism, combating foreign espionage, opioid interdiction, cybersecurity. All four of those have significant ongoing challenges that a Department of Justice is going to have to deal with, and that the FBI is going to have to deal with, and it's the FBI that Gaetz wants to get rid of. So, and that goes back to your point, David, also about Governor Noem running a $60 billion budget, 230,000 employee Department of Homeland Security. That requires a certain level of familiarity or expertise. And even when you talk to people who have moved into these agencies, even those who have experience, the startup time that it takes to kind of get the organization aligned so that you can then have it go do the things you can do is a really serious challenge. Just to get human bodies, even if your intent is malevolent, just to get the bodies in the right offices to get them to do the thing is an extraordinary leadership challenge. And if you haven't had that before, I don't know that you can create it just by adding water. Can we just add about Matt Gaetz, by the way, that he was both identified as someone who asked for a blanket pardon at the end of the Trump administration for all the crimes he might yet get caught doing, and also that the former Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, said that the only reason that McCarthy was bounced from his job, which Gaetz, gets credit for doing, was because he wouldn't kill the investigation into the 17-year-old statutory rape ethics investigation. Those are also, I think, pertinent obstruction of justice details.
Before we go, I want to talk about the Musk-Ramaswamy Department of Government Efficiency non-department, because it's terrifyingly fascinating to me. If you look at what Musk did at Twitter, Musk came in at Twitter. Now, admittedly, that was a company he owned lock, stock, and barrel. He had full authority as the CEO to do more or less whatever he wanted, but he stripped it to the studs. He just got rid of huge numbers of people, and he made it cheaper. And Twitter, I'm sure, spends less on personnel, way less than it did several years ago. And it still functions. It's also like a much more chaotic, and it's worth a fraction of what it was worth when he bought it. So I do think if you want to make government cheaper, you can do it. You can definitely fire lots of people, and you can have the government do a lot less. It is just not at all clear that this is what people want. You still need to pay for missiles, and you need to maintain the missiles, and you need to send the Social Security checks, and you do need to do the agricultural research so that farmers' yields rise, and you do need to distribute the highway funds, and someone has to administer all of that stuff. And if you belong to the view that, this is just a bunch of waste, you will get rid of a lot of government work and maybe even entire government departments, but you're also going to get rid of all this capacity and all this function that somebody in America values. And I'm sure I know there are wasteful programs that the United States government does. How could there not be in a budget of the size that we have? But it's also the case that most of what's passed there, most of what's being done is being done because people who are pretty smart and expert have decided, oh yeah, this is something we should do as a nation.
Or Congress ordered them to do it.
Or Congress, yeah. So it's going to be really interesting if the FBI ceases existing and there are no longer, investigations of international terrorism cells that are growing up in the United States. That'll be a thing to experience.
Or is this another example, John, of what you were talking earlier, where this is your opening bid and you don't actually do these things? You don't dismantle whole departments, but you do other things within them that are more boring and incremental and still have great effects. And it's going to be really important to cover, as you were saying, David, what's actually happening more than the threats, I think.
This episode of the Gabfest is brought to you by Glean. AI has the potential to help everyone be more efficient at work, but only if it deeply understands the data, people, processes, and context specific to your work. That's exactly what Glean's Work AI platform does. Glean starts by connecting and understanding all your company data across the apps you use every day. Glean's powerful AI assistant helps you find answers, generate content, and automate work. And with Glean's search and work hub capabilities, employees can find everything they need to know to do their best work and stay aligned. And Glean has solutions for all kinds of teams, from customer support to engineering to sales to HR, which is why hundreds of enterprises, including some of the world's leading tech, telecom, retail, manufacturing, and banking businesses, put AI to work with Glean. Visit glean.com/Gabfest to see how Glean can help every employee at your company do their best work with AI. That's glean.com/Gabfest to request a demo today. Glean, work AI for all.
Planned Parenthood Federation of America exists so that all people can get access to the sexual and reproductive care and education they need to make informed decisions about their health. More than 2 million patients a year rely on the services Planned Parenthood health centers provide, like STI testing and treatment, birth control, gender-affirming care, abortion, cancer screenings, and so much more. Right now, all across the country, reproductive health care and rights are under attack from public officials who are out of step with the will of the vast majority of Americans. The constitutional right to abortion, control of our bodies, and the health care we need has been stolen from us. And now politicians in 47 states, yes, 47, have introduced bills that would block people from getting the sexual and reproductive care they need. Planned Parenthood knows that equitable access to health care, including safe, legal abortion, is a human right. Right now, Planned Parenthood needs your help to protect access to health care. Donate today by visiting PlannedParenthood.org/protect.
This episode is brought to you by Public.com. Interest rates have fallen, but you can still lock in a 6% or higher yield with a bond account at Public.com. That's a pretty big deal because when rates drop, so can the interest you earn on your investment. A bond account allows you to lock in a 6% or higher yield with a diversified portfolio of high yield and investment grade corporate bonds. So while other people are watching their returns shrink, you could be earning regular interest payments. But a yield is not locked in until you invest, so check it out. The good news is it takes only a couple of minutes to sign up at Public.com. Lock in a 6% or higher yield with a bond account only at Public.com/Political Gabfest. Brought to you by Public Investing, member FINRA and SIPC. As of September 26, 2024, the average annualized yield to worst across the bond account is greater than 6%. Yield to worst is not guaranteed, not an investment recommendation. All investing involves risk. Visit public.com/disclosure/bond-account for more info. Democratic recriminations reached Murder on the Orient Express levels this week. What caused the loss? Was it inflation that caused the defeat? Was it a global anti-incumbent revulsion? Was it the Gaza war, support for the Gaza war, lack of support for the Gaza war? Was it identity politics? Was it the abandonment of the working class by the Democratic Party? Was it elite snobbery? Was it sexism? Was it racism? Was it the Democrats misread the 2020 election results? Was it the late withdrawal of Biden? Was it Biden's withdrawal at all? Was it, in fact, not even that big a defeat? So, John, you think more clearly about this stuff than almost anybody I know. What have we learned? What did we learn from the voting patterns that we now have more information about the voting? What did we learn about who voted for Harris and Trump and how that reflects some kind of change in the country?
The Democrats lost more than the Republicans won, and that's in line with the view that this was 90% of it, 95% of it was the fact that an incumbent administration got pounded the way incumbent administrations have gotten pounded all over the world because of inflation, because of the and more broadly, I think the hangover from COVID, and as a result, all the small incremental changes that may have that may be discussed have to be seen in that context. Trump won the election with 250,000 more votes, which is by presidential landslide standards, I think 50 out of 54. In other words, not a landslide really at all. Trump got more votes than he did before, but not, Ronald Reagan in 1984 got 11 million more votes than he got in 1980. George W. Bush got 12 million more votes in 2004 than 2000. So it needs to be thought of more as a problem for the Democratic Party. Now, the question is whether it's a problem for the Democratic Party that's a result of circumstances or actual challenges within the party. And the reason that you can't totally, if you're a Democrat, wave away even things as small, although, again, in context, small things have to be considered because if elections are going to be really, really close, small things have to be kept in mind because it might make the difference in close elections.
Emily, which of the explanations for the Democratic underperformance have struck with you and which haven't?
Well, one thing I have to say about the explanations is that one sees people grabbing onto the explanation that fits with their preconceived notions of what they would like the explanation to be. And I feel wary of that in myself. So I will first of all say that I want this to be a moment of self-reflection, especially among the mostly well-off, often white progressives who have a lot of power in the Democratic Party and liberal elite institutions, because I think when you lose the majority of people who make less than $50,000 a year, less than $100,000 a year, and you have a demographic shift in which you see Latino voters moving substantially toward Republicans, then there's something wrong. Something is not getting across. You've kind of lost touch with how to talk and reach and move regular people who are supposed to be the, core of the Democratic Party. To that end, I've been struck by two things. One is that turnout was down substantially, which I think is an enthusiasm problem all of its own. The second is the data about counties showing majority or substantially Latino parts of the country really shift their allegiances. I was talking to one of my colleagues at the Times, Jenny Medina, who covers Latinos and especially in the context of politics. And she was saying, look, there's something very unsurprising about this, given the economic hardship people were feeling because of rising prices. People come to this country, they want to do well. They want to aspire to, have more prosperity, have better lives for their families. And people were feeling a hit. There were so many quotes about people feeling like they had to spend tons of money to fill their grocery carts, or they couldn't take their kids to the supermarket anymore because they couldn't afford to buy what they want. It's just, that seems important to me all on its own, separate from these questions about, language policing, how you talk to people, the long litmus tests of issues that Democrats have adopted that I think to some people feel either alienating or distracting.
Right. So that's the structural, that's the 95% of this, which is structural. And there's no way, I can't think of a single administration that's been able to get on the right side of explaining and moving public opinion about the economy. Various administrations that I've covered during bad economic times where administrations try to say, well, no, but these things are going well, whether it's Biden, George W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, it's super hard for political maneuvering to change the opinions of people as they live and experience them. But we also there's no denying that the Biden administration's position on the border was bad and mistaken and poorly handled in a bunch of different ways. Afghanistan was a real thing as well. So getting the calibration right between what was super difficult for any administration to overcome, although they, you could argue they played a bad hand poorly by talking about the transitory nature of inflation, although Fed governors were talking about the transitory role of inflation too. But there are also these contributory things, which are actual things they did in office, which are another category other than this, what the sort of culture kind of excessive, quote unquote, wokeness.
Do you guys think that the Democrats' problem with the working class and with Latinos in particular, say, has to do with inflation, or it has to do and the sense that they mishandled inflation, or is it a broader sense that Democrats are on the wrong side of issues? Because it's weird to me, because there's no doubt, if you dig into the issues, that when you look at who's on the side of working people and poorer people in this country, Democrats on the issues are much better. They support public schools, funding for public schools. They are the ones who buttressed Medicaid. They are the ones who created Obamacare that allows so many people to get health coverage. They've supported unions historically and backed unions in fights against management. Yes, Biden was overseeing a tremendous amount of inflation, but these other issues, they are on the right side. I'm using that in quotes, for working people in general. That's what most working people in this country want. And is it that most working people actually don't want that? They don't know that Democrats want that, or it's just so much less important than people's sense that inflation is crushing them and their irritation that the border is chaotic?
I mean, I'm going to go with much less important, because when you ask people before the election and in the exit polls, what's most important to you, it was resoundingly about the economy, and the border was high up there as well. And the kind of, policy decisions and preferences you're talking about, David, are sort of like underlying. They kind of get taken for granted. They're not the things that really like heated up the campaign, right? I mean, people weren't talking really about like the right to public education or funding for public schools. And so I think those basic premises got swamped. And I think on inflation and the border, that a lot of voters concluded that Democrats did not feel a big sense of urgency about these things, that whatever they were doing to address them was like too little, too late. And given how long it took President Biden to really address the border, you can see why voters concluded that.
And it's why at the time we were saying that the outrageous lies that Trump told about eating pets and all of that in Ohio sorted for a lot of people, not as the actual words that he was using or facts of the case so much, but as more proof that he was tougher on immigration than any other human. And if they felt the Biden team was slow and didn't care, here was a guy who was, going to fix it all. And that those outrageous statements ended up sending that kind of signal. And so which skips right over the actual facts of the case.
John, so the autopsies have been done or are being done. What do you think the Democrats are likely to do as next steps? What is the way in which the party can sort of get back on their feet? And obviously, it's going to be very hard at a national level, because they're going to be without any particular power in Congress and with the executive and in the Supreme Court. But what is it that parties sort of this far out of power do to right themselves?
Well, one thing they do is they benefit from being out of power, because being in power is tough. You have to do stuff. You have to make a bet that tending to unemployment and keeping it low. Unemployment reached lower levels in all of the battleground states except for Nevada during the Biden administration than it did ever in the Trump administration. So I'm not talking about highs because of the skewing of COVID. I'm talking about reaching its lows. The Biden administration made a bet that keeping people employed was worth the risk of adding to inflation. You have to make hard choices like that. And then when you make those hard choices, your opponent gets to beat you up for the bad thing that happened, leaving aside the fact that inflation was a global phenomenon from coming out of COVID-19. And so not all of it can be tied to the choices of an administration. But what the Democrats potentially could benefit from is that specific choices that Donald Trump is making on tariffs, immigration, spending will all be and are already being assessed by the bond market as being inflationary. So there is a direct connection between what he's proposed. God knows what the Fed's going to do about how to predict and deal with a Trump world. So I think that any party out of power benefits from that. I think secondarily, if the Democratic Party doesn't swing at every pitch, going back to your point to Iglesias, and that we've talked about a lot on our own, by the way, before, which is focusing on what's happening, not just on the circus. If Democrats focus on those core issues that they have a long history of trying to appeal to. And we might also add in your list of data that when you poll people on what the two candidates were offering with respect to the economy and strip their names off of it, the Harris policies well outperformed the Trump ones. So if Democrats basically say you wanted this election to be about regular people in America and helping them, why aren't you doing anything on X, Y, and Z? And that's a place to begin the conversation. But, you know, who says those things and also who pulls the party in the new direction? And, you know, because in order to do that, you have to, denigrate or draw distinctions with other members of your own party. And the Democratic Party, when it gets in those kind of fights, it can get kind of ugly.
Emily, last question on this topic. Do you think, as some have argued, I think Ezra Klein has argued this, that the Democrats are a party that roots out heretics and doesn't look for converts? Or is that actually true? Does the party need to have a kind of broad, encompassing, welcoming attitude that it doesn't have?
I think that right now the party is associated with a lot of purity tests. Mike Pesca of the podcast The Gist wrote a piece in The Atlantic this week comparing the Democratic Party to HR departments, talking about them as like being the sort of fussy place of compliance and language policing and rules, none of which is a whole lot of fun, even though it's sometimes necessary. And I thought that was a good metaphor for capturing what doesn't feel broadly welcoming, I think, to a lot of people.
As we were thinking about this today, and I was writing, how do we describe deportation policies? And my natural instinct, maybe it's because I'm badly trained on decades of false language, is to say illegal immigrants or even illegal aliens. And I'm like, oh, but am I allowed to say that anymore? I better not say that. I should say undocumented. And am I supposed to say undocumented immigrants, undocumented people, undocumented? And I was like, I don't even know what to do. And I feel like there's a whole bunch of Gabfest listeners who are going to judge me based on whatever language I've used. So it's obviously, that's a very extremely tiny example, but it did occur to me today.
It's not that tiny. I mean, I think there is, to me, something troubling about calling a person illegal, like the noun of that bothers me. Of course. But I do agree with you that deciding that means that like you have to excommunicate someone is a different step from hearing it and wondering whether that's really a good idea or not.
And in this case, I mean, obviously a comparison between the two parties would be interesting because obviously the Republican Party has gone through a catapulting of heretics, unparalleled in modern history. I mean, FDR tried to root out people he didn't like in his own party, and he failed miserably. Here's FDR, an incredibly powerful president. He was not able to do it in his own party. Donald Trump has swept out all opposition basically completely. Think of those who voted for his impeachment. Think of the senators who are not in the Senate now that were when he was first elected. I'm thinking about Jeff Flake, Mitt Romney, John McCain. None of those folks are around anymore. So the Republican Party, if you're a Democrat seeking for some understanding, jettisoning heretics is like not obviously the wrong way to go. Now, obviously, Donald Trump is a different character. A Democratic Party doesn't have a Donald Trump, that so forth and so on. The analogy only goes so far, but it is not evidently true that jettisoning heretics is a bad political move. For those who want to jettison those heretics, they might find evidence that it sometimes works. But I think also the Democratic Party stops and has a conversation about whether jettisoning heretics is good or bad. And that's something the Republican Party doesn't do. And so in having the conversation, and I didn't read Mike's piece, and so I apologize if this is totally wrong, but I mean, it is not crazy for a Democrat to say, but the guy who was president didn't spend excessive amounts of time playing with language. I mean, he passed the CHIPS Act. He passed legislation to finally deal with America's massive challenges with infrastructure. He passed more climate change legislation than any other president. That there are basically middle of the road insulin prices are reduced. There is a middle of the road meat and potatoes part of his agenda that nobody's talking about because of the loss, but the Democrats in their debates, there's got to be a voice who says, wait a minute, the entire administration wasn't about purity tests, and you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Oh, for sure. And this is where it comes back to they didn't lose by that much. And right, they don't have to throw it all away. On the other hand, Biden never did anything to distance himself from some of the purity testing, right? And he wasn't a hugely strong presence as president, in part because, you know, he was having like diminished cognitive, what should I say about this? Help me out here.
Oh yeah, you can't even say you're fulfilling with the language.
I'm not entirely sure how to characterize it. In any case, he was not like entirely on his game in setting the tone.
This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Found. For all you small business owners, between budgeting, God, I'm in budgeting season, tracking expenses, staying organized for tax time, that is a good chunk of your day. Get back to doing what you love. Let Found do the rest. Found is an all-in-one, easy-to-use app that's designed for small businesses and solo entrepreneurs. It lets you manage your financial tasks really easily. You can manage your money, track your spending, invoice your clients, even handle your taxes so you can focus on running your business. And you'll save hundreds or even thousands of dollars on bank fees and app subscriptions because Found has no hidden fees, no account maintenance fees, no minimum balances, and there's no paperwork or credit checks when signing up. So try Found for free at found.com/Gabfest. Sign up for Found for free today at found.com/Gabfest. Found is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services are provided by Piermont Bank, member FDIC. Found core features are free. They also offer an optional paid product, Found Plus. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Lumen. Your metabolism is your body's engine. So optimizing your metabolic health translates to easier weight management, improved energy levels, better fitness results, and better sleep. Introducing Lumen, the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath. To use Lumen, all you have to do is breathe into your Lumen device first thing in the morning, and the app lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs. Then Lumen gives you a personalized nutrition plan for that day based on your measurements. It also gives you tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, workout, sleep, and even stress management. Breathe into it before and after workouts and meals so you know exactly what's going on in your body in real time. And Lumen will give you tips to keep you on top of your health game. So if you want to stay on track with your health this holiday season, go to lumen.me/Gabfest to get 15% off your Lumen. Lumen makes a great gift too. So go to lumen.me/Gabfest for 15% off your purchase. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Quince. The weather is cooler. It's so lovely. I love it so much. There's so much to look forward to. There's pumpkin spice lattes. Not for me, but a good hot latte. And then there's slipping into cozy sweaters from Quince. I've been shopping at Quince this fall. I've got a great pair of pants, extremely cozy. I got a great pair of pants that are extremely cozy. I have some new sheets and pillowcases that are just divine to get into on a nice, cool night. And the great thing about my Quince items is that they're wonderful, they're comfortable, they're cozy, but they cost 50 to 80% less than similar brands. And they're able to do that because they partner directly with top factories and cut out the cost of the middleman, which passes the savings on to us. So get cozy in Quince's high-quality wardrobe essentials. Go to quince.com/Gabfest for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/Gabfest to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/Gabfest. We're joined by Caitlin Dickerson, a staff writer at The Atlantic who won a 2023 Pulitzer for her reporting on Trump's child separation policies. Caitlin, who is no relation to John that we know of, is one of the leading immigration reporters in the country. She's also working on a book about deportation. So we asked her to join us to talk through how and whether a Trump administration could carry out its threats to deport millions of undocumented people living here and what the consequences could be. And I should note that Emily had to run off to catch a flight, so she won't be joining us for this segment. But Caitlin, welcome to the Gabfest. I want to start with a basic question. Like, is it physically possible to deport millions of people who are living here in an undocumented way?
Physically possible is a tricky question. I think the biggest logistical challenge, there are many kind of at every stage of the process of arresting people, detaining them, and then ultimately removing them from the country. But where the rubber would really meet the road when it came to millions of deportations is the diplomatic piece that comes at the end, because we can't, as of right now, and this isn't to say that Stephen Miller won't try anyway, but we can't unilaterally deport people without permission of the home country where they're being sent home to. We've never thus far carried out deportations without getting travel documents approved and signed off on in advance. And so that at the back end is what could prevent millions of deportations from taking place. I think you could see far more enforcement and removal activity than we've seen in the past under the Trump administration. And we can get into the machinations of what that would look like. But, I'm looking at a lot of commentary and coverage around how all these deportations that Trump is promising aren't feasible. And while I think it's important for us to have this conversation about logistical challenges the administration will inevitably face, there's a way in which that kind of commentary can suggest that not a lot of harm can be done when a lot of harm can be done. So I also spent a lot of time reporting on family separations under the Trump administration. The goal had been to separate every single family crossing the border during that period of time, which was tens of thousands a month. Of course, the administration never achieve that, but thousands of kids and parents were still separated and are still experiencing the consequences of that today. So I know we're probably here to throw some cold water on Trump's promises for deportations, but it's also the case that even if you increase them by 50%, that's still a lot. Even if you increase them by 25%, that's still a lot, especially if you're talking about people who've been living in the country for a very long time.
Just to set the table, can you give us the most reliable estimates for the number of people living here without legal protections, and sort of broadly, what are the categories of those people? And also people who are here sort of legally, but like maybe not for the long term, like awaiting asylum claims or under TPS and things like that.
So I'm going to say that the number is still about 11 million. I just spoke earlier this week to Jeff Passel at Pew, who's kind of one of the nation's top 3 experts on this data. Pew is now saying that the number of unauthorized immigrants in the United States is about 12.5 million, but that's because they're counting people who've come in during the Biden administration who either have pending asylum claims, have temporary protective status, came in under a parole program. So they were legally admitted into the country and they're in a legal process. That's why I stick with the 11 million number, because Pew's argument is that those additional folks that they're counting have a provisional status that could go away and may very well go away very early on in the Trump administration. He may decide to get rid of those programs, and then all of a sudden those new entrants are added to the mix. I'm saying 11 because I think when people hear, well, at the beginning of the Biden administration, you had 11 million unauthorized immigrants, and now you have 12.5, they're picturing 1.5 million people stealing across the border in the dark of night, which didn't actually happen.
So, Caitlin, can you then, in that number of 11 million, that was always something we tried to do, which is like, how many of the 11 million are unknown? In other words, that did in fact steal across the border in the dark of night and are just roaming the countryside with no connection to the federal government at all?
Well, it's hard to say because that number doesn't come from our immigration justice system. It comes from census data that estimates how many immigrants are living in the United States. And then from that, statisticians subtract the number of people who've been legally permitted on visas, and then they come up with 11 million. We have about 2 million pending asylum cases. So those people are all accounted for. And far more, I wish I had a precise number for you, but who are on the radar of the federal government because they've come into contact with ICE at some point. And so they might be on a monitoring program where they have to check in on a monthly basis or even on an annual basis and basically let ICE know they're still in the country, they're not committing any crimes, they're working, they're supporting their family, and then ICE will say, okay, we're going to leave you alone for the foreseeable future, but come back again at this deadline. There are people in situations like that. There are people who've received prosecutorial discretion, so they're deportable, but prosecutors in federal court have agreed before an immigration judge to administratively close a case. And during Trump's last administration, he wanted to reopen a lot of cases that had been administratively closed under the Obama administration. So those folks are in a kind of limbo. We have about 500,000 people who are still on DACA. The number was much higher previously, but several 100,000 either found ways to get permanent legal status or left the country. And then we've got people who are on TPS. I think that Pew estimates about 1.5 million people who are in these provisional programs where they have permission to be here. If that goes away, if those programs go away, then they become deportable under Trump. So I don't have a precise number for you for how many people are on the government's radar and easily findable, but certainly it's several million people. So finding people really isn't going to be the greatest challenge. It's going to be the resources that are needed to go and pick them up.
And to your previous point about the interim harm that can be done between today and actually finding a country that would take them back or whatever, is that essentially private prisons? Is that why private prison stock has gone up? That the assumption is that the roundups will take place, and then while the paperwork is being figured out, that they will be held in some sort of facility?
That is the expectation, that they'll be held in a facility. I think that I would argue the first and greatest logistical challenge that's going to come into play before detention is going to be having enough law enforcement officers to go and arrest people. So right now, when people are arrested by ICE, they're held in a combination of privately run facilities owned by private prison companies that are making a lot of money right now, as well as local jails that rent space to immigration authorities. And you also have had the temporary use of these tent cities that have been put up. You might remember photos of tents that were constructed in the desert in Texas to hold kids during the Trump administration the first time around. So there are emergency procedures that Trump could maneuver to try to get more space opened up quickly. City and county jails are often really eager to contract out extra space to ICE because they make a lot of money. And yes, these private prison companies will be ready to if not build, probably go into unused prison facilities and clean them up and get them ready for use as quickly as possible. But you have right now about 7,000 agents working for ICE in 25 field offices across the country who go out and make arrests. At various points in the last 20 years, let's say, those agents have worked under strictures that determine whether they can arrest anybody they find who doesn't have legal status, or whether they have to only focus on people who have serious criminal records. If you get rid of all of those strictures, which Trump did his first time in office, you really don't see deportations go up all that dramatically. he only got to about 250,000 deportations a year using that system. Where we could see the numbers go up much higher is if we see an increased use of programs that really blew up under the Obama administration, where you have immigration authorities working closely with local law enforcement and creating a funnel so that anybody who is picked up for a traffic stop or anything, even a relatively innocuous charge, is going to be questioned about their immigration status and can be turned over to ICE. Those programs, if they expand again like they did under Obama, can really increase the numbers. So your listeners may recall Obama got his nickname Deporter-in-Chief when he exceeded 400,000 deportations a year because of those programs. And then I think to get to something like 1 million, which is what Trump has promised, what you would need is not just programs where you have ICE officers working in jails and picking people up still under the jurisdiction of the federal government, but where you have state and local law enforcement working in immigration enforcement. So throughout American history, immigration enforcement has been under the purview of the federal government. That's something that the Supreme Court has defended again and again. SB 1070, the Arizona law that Joe Arpaio championed to try to turn local law enforcement in Arizona into immigration authorities themselves by making illegal immigration a state crime. Those policies have not, and those attempts to make immigration enforcement part of the purview of state and local law enforcement have not survived thus far, but the Supreme Court has changed.
And is that a situation where it's likely to be mandatory, where every state and local government, or it's sort of like up to this particular state and local jurisdiction, whether they choose to cooperate with it?
It depends what the state laws that end up being passed say. And I think when we look at the way that legislation has been written around abortion, and even in some cases around immigration, I mean, it's not, I don't think, out of the realm of possibility to see some state legislators draft legislation that does say, if you work in local law enforcement, you have to check people's immigration statuses. And if you don't, you may face consequences. You may pay a fine, or you may even face criminal charges yourself. I mean, you could see state legislators passing laws like that already. And this always happens. You have sheriffs coming out and saying, we won't participate in immigration enforcement. Lots of local law enforcement officials don't want to get involved in this game because it means that people in the community won't participate with them and won't help them solve crime. People, there's a chilling effect that occurs. People stop reporting crimes. They stop answering questions by police because they fear that speaking to police can all of a sudden make them or their relatives vulnerable to immigration enforcement. And so there are going to be fights. You'll probably see legal fights waged from both directions, but it's, you've had half a dozen states who've passed legislation making unauthorized immigration a state crime in the Biden administration alone. Most of that hasn't really gone into effect because of where the Supreme Court stands now. But again, we could see that changing. And I think that's what would help Trump get closer to the numbers that he's promising, and why I don't think that we should dismiss them whole cloth.
What's your sense about whether they could or would go after kids in schools? Like, I feel like that undocumented kids in schools that's generally been left alone. Is that something that is left alone because the Supreme Court has said you can't do anything there, or because it's just custom not to go after kids in schools?
And schools have school resource officers. So if you were to have legislation passed in a state that said if you work in local law enforcement and you encounter somebody in a criminal context, or you question them, you have to question their immigration status, you could see school resource officers getting involved as well. So, I interviewed Tom Homan extensively when I was reporting on family separations about his thought process leading up to pushing for family separations under Trump. And he talked about how throughout his decades-long career in immigration enforcement, he said, we've always avoided families to the extent possible. And he even told a story about an enforcement operation he was involved in Las Vegas decades prior, where the local ICE field office decided it would be a good idea to stop buses on a major freeway to try to get their numbers and hit a quota and make as many arrests as they could. But they ended up arresting a bunch of moms whose kids were at school and needed to be picked up at the end of the day. And there was a huge backlash. The locally elected officials were on the phone to ICE, upset and demanding the release of these mothers immediately. He said, I think the arrest happened on a Friday. By Monday, Congress was calling for these mothers to be released. And he described it to me as a real lesson around the fact that it's not worth it to go after kids and moms because the public backlash is too strong, and it ends up harming the credibility of the agency. You know, everybody's filing lawsuits, then you have to release everybody anyway. You don't really get the removal number that you're going for as an ICE agent. So in general, I would say Tom Homan's experience that he shared with me is what I typically hear from people who work in ICE, that it's just not worth the backlash to go after kids and parents. But I think that we're in a different time now. And so while I don't think that nationwide, you'll see enforcement in schools. And in fact, over the years, I've spoken to many school principals and people who work with undocumented kids or kids whose parents are undocumented. And a lot of times those folks feel a real personal sense of obligation to protect these kids, protect their data, protect their immigration statuses, do what they can to ensure that they're not deported or that their parents aren't deported. But I think you'll have some school districts where educators and leadership might be game to participate. And something that always happens and in my experience increases in moments like these, when you have a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, when you have an administration that's promising a lot of deportations, is that you have people taking it upon themselves to get involved in immigration enforcement, even if it's not their job. So I'm thinking of one story I've reported on where a pregnant woman and her husband went to the bank to cash a check. And it was actually an IRS refund check because they had overpaid in their taxes, but both of them did not have legal status. And the bank teller asked for ID. The husband hands over his Mexican identification, and the bank teller says, do you have an American ID? He says, no, this is all I have. So she says, okay, I'll be right back. She goes into the back, and sure enough, 20 minutes later, ICE shows up because she's just decided to call ICE of her own volition. And so, you're asking about schools. You can have programs where schools are involved in this kind of thing formally, but you can also have one person who works at a school and decides that they want to try to help the Trump administration get as many deportations as possible. And so they're calling in tips to the local ICE field office. And then it depends on where the field office is and frankly, who's running it and what are their politics when they're making a decision about who to arrest and who not to arrest. And, I talked before about the strictures that are sometimes placed on ICE agents, sometimes not, regarding who they can arrest and who can't they. You can imagine a scenario where DHS lawyers say, after January, this is going to be too messy. We're going to face too many lawsuits. And they convince Trump and they convince Stephen Miller and Governor Noem, who's going to be the DHS secretary, to leave kids and their moms off the table. But you can also envision a scenario where Stephen Miller is completely unwilling to accept that, where Tom Homan says, no, we're not going to. And from my reporting on how family separations came to be, I know that if they decide they do want to go after kids, for example, there will be mandates to ICE field offices that you have to arrest kids. And remember, there were prosecutors who said when family separations were underway that they refused to participate and they were threatened with being fired. And so it's really, we really can't definitively say right now that kids will be off the table. I don't think we've been given any evidence to suggest that they would.
Help us understand how we should think about the use or not use of National Guard to solve the roundup problem with only 7,000 ICE agents.
So again, as it stands legally, the National Guard cannot be deployed in the interior of the country to participate in law enforcement. But what could happen is that Trump would order it, and a lawsuit would emerge challenging it, and then the Supreme Court would have to decide. I mean, it does feel like everything is on the table right now, when the law itself, it could be changed, when, you know, these distinctions that have existed for over 100 years could be changed. And so we really have to see how the Supreme Court starts to decide cases around immigration enforcement, and whether they agree with arguments that Trump and Stephen Miller have made that, you know, that the United States is in the midst of an invasion. You know, if they can prove that legally, then there's more leeway for the National Guard to get involved. And there are probably other arguments that I'm not thinking of now that could be made. And so, you know, I hate to respond in a way that's so vague, but I think I'm coming from the perspective of having spent all this time reporting on a very granular level on meetings and phone calls and procedures that took place under the Trump administration. And what I learned in trying to figure out how family separations came to be was that you had Stephen Miller, who at the time had this much lower position, right? He was a senior counselor, but he was on the phone for 4 years yelling orders at cabinet secretaries. And the cabinet secretaries you had in place during those 4 years, you had John Kelly, you had Elaine Duke, Kirsten Nielsen, and Kevin McAleenan. And the four of them, although susceptible to pressure, were very concerned about maintaining the rule of law, about not violating what lawyers told them directly to do or not to do. And then ultimately you had Chad Wolf, who really wasn't in place long enough to do much anyway, but I think was chosen because he wasn't as concerned about maintaining historic norms as he was about satisfying Trump and Miller. And so what I see in this new pick for a DHS secretary is someone who Stephen Miller, in his even higher role now, does not expect to push back on him at all, you know? And so it's things that we've never seen before could play out. And I don't think it's unreasonable to expect them when you know you're going to have a DHS secretary who's getting orders directly from Stephen Miller. You know, she doesn't have experience with Homeland Security. Is she going to be willing to push back? And if not, a lot of these things that we're talking about, like the National Guard and like kids, may be on the table.
Caitlin Dickerson of The Atlantic, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, let's go to cocktail chatter. John, it is the end of another week. What are you and the missus going to be chattering about?
The Onion says that it, as of Thursday, I don't know if this will end up being a joke, but it says, The Onion says it has bought InfoWars from Alex Jones.
Oh my God, are you serious?
Yeah, that's what they say. So the release, or supposedly they bought it so that The Onion can turn InfoWars, which was among the worst, if not the worst. It's hard to know because I don't know but among the worst purveyors of misinformation, bile, inhuman sludge that makes the project of trying to be humans in the world harder and worse. And Alex Jones, of course, at the head of it, was dedicated singularly to that project. So that fortunately failed, and so it's in bankruptcy, and basically the Onion's going to buy it and turn it into a parody of itself, which should be a real challenge because when it was actively engaged in its primary mission, it was a parody of itself. But the Onion's going to do its work with the shell of InfoWars, and I think that it's a great piece of performance art to do that if that's in fact what they're doing. My other thing is that I'm in the middle of reading Stoner by John Williams, which is a book I did not know about until I went to St. Louis, and it's the product of having basically figured out how to fix my eyes, which is that basically I have distance glasses that are so powerful it makes it very hard to read. So I got myself, which is hard because you have to get a doctor to do it, to give me distance glasses that are only half as good. So I can't really see past the book, but I can see the book. And so I can read again the way I did in college. And this book is among those that I can now sit down and read for, more than a short period of time. And it's such a fascinating, delicate portrait of a sort of sad, but stoically, maybe even heroic, I'm not to the end yet, life. And I would never read this kind of book unless I had the time and ability to read books again. Anyway, if anybody's read it out there, send in your thoughts about it.
Wait, this is not John Williams, the cinematic composer.
No. It's John Williams, who taught at the University of Denver.
Okay.
No. Anyway, it's so that's what I have to say about Stoner.
Emily, what's your chatter?
I went to see the movie Anora last weekend. It is so...
Ooh, lucky you. I can't wait to go. Can't wait.
Really, really good. I get nervous when I have high expectations for a movie, but this one really lived up to it, so I'm just going to add to them. It's about an escort. She calls herself an escort, not a sex worker. In New York City, she meets up with this young Russian, completely hilarious, irresponsible kind of would-be playboy, and then gets mixed up with his very mobbed up family. There's an amazing fight action scene in which she's struggling with these older, heavyweight Russians. Then a sort of, it's not a dream sequence, but this sort of glum but very charming adventures that they have looking for the young Russian guy. It's just a really fascinating movie about people whose lives you don't usually see on screen. And I felt like it also just has a lot to say about how people's dreams intersect with the much harsher, more frightening reality anyway. And it has an amazing ending too. So I really recommend it, Anora, the movie.
My chatter, a couple of quick ones. So number one, I was visiting our former colleague, Julia Turner, in Los Angeles this week. And because she lives in Los Angeles, she's got fruit trees, and she has a passion fruit tree or something. And her family eats passion fruits out of hand. They cut them in half and just eat them from the passion fruit shell. And they are shockingly delicious.
Are you saying they have a passion for passion fruits?
They have a raw passion for raw passion fruits. They're so sweet and tangy and explosive. They're slimy, which I don't like, but the sweetness and tanginess and explosiveness is extraordinary. So I recommend a raw passion fruit if you ever get the chance. Second quick thing, The Perfect Couple on Netflix is, if you liked The White Lotus, you'll love it. It's a dead body, rich people, beautiful place, hateful, filled with misery, but very beautiful and fun and amazing cast. Finally, because I'm doing a triple chatter, those of you who are interested in taking my Civil War fort tour, I give a tour of a secret Civil War fort deep in Rock Creek Park, and every few months I add a few new tours. And so I just added a crop of tours in the spring and summer of next year. So if you can join me, I'd love to have you. You can look for Exploring a Secret Fort on Airbnb, Exploring a Secret Fort, or you can email me at davidplotz@gmail.com and I will point you to it. But just look for Exploring a Secret Fort on Airbnb. It's really fun. Saturday or Sunday, usually in the afternoon. Takes an hour. It's great. Listeners, please keep sending your listener chatter to us at gabfest at slate.com. And our listener chatter this week comes from Elena in Los Angeles.
Hi, Gabfest. Elena here, a longtime listener from LA by way of DC. My chatter is about a book I just read, Eve, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution by Kat Bohannon. The author examines the latest scientific research and thinking on the ways human evolution was driven by women, often women and their children specifically. It really turned on its head a lot of conventional thinking and narratives we've had about human evolution being some kind of male-dominated, individualistic, competitive story. It actually makes the case for the ingenuity of mothers, who likely were the first to use tools, mothers being central to language development, the necessity of social support and cooperation in birthing and raising children, the case against human men being particularly rapey, and even makes the case for matriarchal societies in our evolutionary past. I found it fascinating and empowering as someone who recently gave birth, and I wanted to recommend it to your listeners.
That's all for our episode this week, but we also have a bonus episode in your feed, and it is a doozy. There's an incredible story in the New York Times about the brain trauma that some sailors are enduring in their service on the Navy's highest speed speedboats. And we have reporter Dave Phillips from the Times coming to talk to us about it and what we should expect our service people to endure. And it is an absolutely fascinating conversation, but that is only for Slate Plus members, who also get lots of other great stuff for their subscriptions. They get bonus episodes, discounts to live shows like our Conundrum live show in New York in a few weeks. They never hit the paywall on the Slate site. So much more. For members, thank you. Really appreciate it. If you're not a member, you can subscribe to Slate Plus directly from the Gabfest show page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or you can visit slate.com/Gabfest Plus to get access. That's our show for today. The Gabfest is produced by Cheyna Roth. Our researcher is Julie Huygen, who went all out on immigration and deportation research this week. Thank you, Julie. Our theme music is by They Might Be Giants. Ben Richmond is Senior Director for Podcast Ops. Alicia Montgomery is the VP of Audio for Slate. For Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson, I'm David Plotz. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.